Good morning, everyone. I hope we all had a nice weekend. So today what we are going to do is Jeopardy for the third quiz. I have not graded them online yet, so don't look for that grade. I'm going to try to do that later today. And then we're going to start lecture 4, which is our prison lecture, and it is a beast of a lecture. So we also have a reading due for this week, so please make sure that you go ahead and do that. In the last class, we didn't get to the little discussion that we're going to have on the meeting or on the reading. So if you haven't done it yet, please make sure that you do it by Wednesday. All right, let's see. We got who's playing today? Both the Bryces. Do we have both Bryces here? Let me look. None of the Bryce. Oh, here's one Bryce coming in. I see Patrick. Where'd he go? I lost him. There's Patrick. And Elijah. Do we have Elijah? There's Elijah. I see Bryce Hersey. Do we have Bryce Gambrell? Where's he at? I see no other Bryce. All right. Let's see. Do we also, I thought I saw Robin in here. Do we have Robin today? There's Robin. Hey, Robin, have you taken this quiz yet? Quiz 3?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Would you mind leaving the meeting and asking to come back? And I'll just leave you in the waiting room while they play Jeopardy, because they're going to play the quiz live.
Okay.
Yeah, so just leave, and then when you request to come back, I'll just leave you in the waiting room while they finish that. Is that cool?
Okay.
Just
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. All right, cool. Okay, I just saw Bryce Gambrell. Okay, so. Hi, Bryce. All right, so both the Bryces, Patrick and Elijah, if you'll pop your mics on.
My mic is on, Joe.
Okay. All right. Let me just get my screen all situated. Okay, here we go.
Call me. Call me. Okay, love you.
Okay. All right, are we ready? Okay, I'm going to take that silence as a yes. Here we go.
Oh, I know it.
What is it, Bryce?
Swift, severe, and certain.
Very good. One for Bryce. Bryce Gambrell. Okay, here we go.
I'm winning. Good job.
What? Quiet you. Here we go.
Is it a severity of punishment?
It is not severity.
Is it certainty of being caught?
It is certainty. Other Bryce. Very good. All right.
Is that like you see your buddy get pulled over and get a speeding ticket, and so you
Stop. That's it. That's vicarious punishment. Give me vicarious punishment avoidance.
But you don't want to get a speeding ticket, so you don't speed around that road, right? No?
No, we got half of it.
Yeah, that's where I got half.
Okay. Who's got the other half for a half a point? Patrick, Elijah, other Bryce.
My initial answer is going to be the same as his, so I'm trying to figure it out.
Okay. Other Bryce.
And my answer would have been the same too.
Yeah, my answer would have been the same as well.
Yeah, so we all suck.
Okay, so what we've got. So what first Bryce said is that you see your buddy speed and he gets a ticket, right? The other one would be you see your buddy speed and he does not get a ticket. That's a vicarious experience with punishment avoidance.
Oh,
Oh,
it's just a reverse thing. Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
I thought it was like he wants to
We
avoid
don't
it.
take that half.
No.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you get half. Okay.
You worded it wrongly.
I doubt that. Okay, let's try this one. It's a true false.
False.
Who said that?
I did.
Oh, that is wrong.
True.
Patrick
Yes,
coming in with
let's go.
true.
Hell yes.
Okay. Here we go. Everybody's favorite.
Shit.
That's not the right answer, but great guess. Let's hear
I
it.
recommend sanctions that are credible and fair.
Ooh, perfect, Bryce. Look at that. There we go. And now you're our winner. I will accept that. You can also get 2 policy implications from the quiz questions. So that second one, you could say that you recommend implementing policies that increase the certainty of getting caught. Or this last one right here, you do not recommend sanctions and policies based on rational choice theory.
So,
Right.
so what is this like? We win and then we get a free 100 on the next quiz too, right?
Hell no, you got 100 on this quiz, and then you're coming back to play again, and then perhaps getting extra credit on your final exam if you keep winning.
So it's not guaranteed.
No, nothing in life is guaranteed.
It's not certain or swift.
Yes, yes. Thank you for putting that into deterrence theory. All right. Do we have questions before we start our prison lecture? All righty. Let me get that pulled up. Okay. So this is the beast of a lecture. Okay. I hope that we can finish. We might have to finish it up on Monday. I'm gonna do my best. If that's the case, I'll move the quiz dates around a little bit. So this is a 2-part lecture. Given that the course is called corrections, we're gonna spend some time on incarceration, okay? So this is 2 parts. The first one we are gonna get through today is prison culture. So what it's like to be in prison. And the second half of this lecture, we're gonna talk about some very popular prison-based rehabilitation programs. And we're gonna go over the research on the effectiveness of them. And then we'll practice some policy implications because that will be the 5th question for your 4th quiz, all right? All right, so what we talked about the first week was the changes in sentencing policies. What we did not discuss was how this affected the prison population. Well, we might have touched on that a little bit, but we're going to look at the numbers here. So there was a dramatic increase in the prison population after 1975. So if we recall, when we switched to the justice model, it was around that time. So between 1935 and about 1970, the average incarceration rate stayed pretty stable at about 106 people or 106 inmates per 100,000 individuals, all right? By 1985, that number had doubled at 202 per 100,000. And by 2000, it had quadrupled with 699 inmates per 100,000. In the 17 years after that, it decreased just a teensy bit. So where we're at right about now is about 568 inmates per 100,000. So what we need to think about here is that due to the extreme levels of our imprisonment rate for the last 15 to 20 years, the size of our correctional population has skyrocketed. And this is what we refer to as mass incarceration. So in comparison to the past, a higher proportion of people that are arrested in the US are sentenced to prison. And those that are sentenced to prison are getting sentenced for longer periods of time than people were before. So what we are seeing is a massive increase in the people that are incarcerated. So if you look right here, so the red is total, the blue is state, and the green is federal. And you can see right here this huge increase from 1980, and this chart stops at about 2014. The other thing that we have to think about is the drug arrest rate. So the war on drugs happened around the same time as the justice model. And what we are seeing was a huge increase in the number of arrests for drug crimes. And because those sentencing policies of the justice model, more of them are getting sentenced to prison for longer periods of time. So both of these charts start in 1980, and you can clearly see how they trend together. So the number of people that were arrested for drug offenses skyrocketed at the same time the number of people being incarcerated skyrocketed. So we're actually going to talk about the war on drugs, but we're not going to talk about that until lecture 7 when we start talking about drug offenders. And I'm actually going to have you guys read an excerpt from The New Jim Crow. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this book. It's amazing. But it really talks about how the war on drugs affected minority populations specifically. So we're going to talk a little bit about that a little later. So we'll just kind of put a pin in that. But for our purposes right now, the war on drugs and the increase in drug arrests had a huge impact on the number of people that were being incarcerated in our country. All right, so given that sort of context that we have so many people incarcerated, let's talk about what it's like to actually live in a prison. So the first thing that comes to mind is the violence in prison, right? So some have portrayed prisoners' hidden world as akin to a Hobbesian state of nature or a war of every man against every other man. So some of the basic aspects of the inmate experience are the use of physical violence as the ultimate resolution to all conflicts. So it does not matter how or why you were wronged. The only way you deal with it is violence. So I had a friend who used to be a correctional officer at the detention center. And he said it was pretty common. Like if someone stole your honey bun, like that results in a stabbing or some sort of fight. He was like, always. He's like, doesn't matter what happens in here. If you're wronged, they're going to fight about it. So the prevailing attitude here is that if you are wronged, you don't turn to the administrators, you handle the problem yourself. Why wouldn't we turn to the administrators?
They probably not gonna do anything. Most likely.
They might do something, but you need to be worried about what the other inmates are going to do because you've now snitched and you're probably going to get stabbed for that. So use of physical violence to resolve all conflicts. That's how you deal with that. You don't sit down and have talk therapy. You know, you don't talk it out. You're going to stab someone or beat the shit out of someone for wronging you, right? So this goes into the next one. So another basic aspect is this value system based on machismo. So the strongest, manliest, one most willing to fight, that is highly valued in an institution. And the last thing to note has a lot to do with violence as well, is the dangerousness of certain locations. So given that you guys all live on a residential campus, you are probably very aware of every single aspect of the building that you live in, and it's no different for the inmates. So the inmates know where there's a hidden stairwell, you know, where there's a hidden corner in the stairwell. They know where there's a blind spot in the camera. If the camera is one that rotates, they know exactly at what point where they will be blind when that camera hits a certain angle. They know when the guards are changing. They know when the guards are writing up their reports, so they're not paying attention. They even know which guards are like less likely to break up a fight than others. So it's not that since you're incarcerated and you're being watched all the time, that doesn't mean you're not going to get your ass kicked. It's in fact the opposite, because these guys are so aware of their environment that they know if they're planning on attacking you, they know exactly where to do it and when to do it and with who is around. So because it is so violent, there are several personal protection strategies, and we'll go through a few of them. So the first one is withdrawal and avoidance, and all of these have pros and cons. So withdrawal and avoidance just means that you completely withdraw inside yourself. You avoid any and all fights. You don't even want to interact with the other inmates, right? So that's a good thing, right? You probably stay out of fights. You stay off the correctional officer's radar. The only problem with that is if you think that at some point someone's not going to challenge you, that's incorrect. So if you get challenged and then you don't react violently or stand up for yourself, you now have a target on your back, right? So if someone steals your honey bun today and you don't react, that means they're going to do it for the rest of the time because they know you're an easy target. So it can be a good thing or it can be a really bad thing. So the next one is formal or informal support. So formal support is talking to a correctional officer. Basically, you're snitching, which is probably going to get you into trouble in the long run. Informal support means you are asking help from the other inmates. So that can have problems too. So one of the ways you can be protected by the other inmates in prison is to join a gang. So you'll always have someone to watch your back, but chances are you're going to be expected to do all kinds of criminal activity as repayment for that. If you don't join a gang and you just ask someone for help, if they provide help for you, you're going to be expected to repay that favor later. And depending on who you've asked for a favor will determine the type of repayment they ask for, but it's never something nice as like, hey, could you just like, you know, grab me a tray off of there? That's not what it's going to be. It's going to be something violent. It's going to be asking for money from the commissary. It's going to be asking you or physically injuring you. It's repayment of a favor in prison is never a good thing. So suspended identity. This is kind of what your reading is about. So it looks like a long article, but it's not. It's a lot of quotes from inmates, and it's a qualitative study, which means it's not going to have a bunch of statistics in it. So suspended identity basically just means that you basically temporarily manipulate your image to be this violent person that you need to be able to survive an incarcerated setting. But so it's got a couple of cons. If the first one is that if you're suspending your identity to become this violent person, then that means you're probably going to get disciplinary infractions or be sent to solitary because you're probably fighting all the time. Or worse, get another charge and you're going to spend more time in prison. Or more psychologically, the longer you suspend this identity and become this violent person, the harder it is to shed that when you get released. And when you get released from prison, if someone steals your honey bun on the outside and you take a homemade shiv and stab them with it, you're going straight back to prison. That's not how we act here. So, utilization of skills. That means that you have a skill that the inmates desire, and so they leave you alone if you can provide that skill. So, who can think of several skills that might be helpful in an incarcerated setting?
Tattoo artist.
Tattoo artist, that's a great one. What else we got?
Making alcohol.
Yes. Does anybody know how to make toilet wine? It's actually very
That shit
simple.
nasty.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying we should drink it. It's just very simple to make. Basically, you just gather a lot of fruits and you put them in a bag, and then you fill it with toilet water, and then you hide it in the toilet so that they don't know, and then the juices will ferment and become alcoholic. So if you're super good at making toilet wine, yes, that's a great skill. What else we got?
Like a barber.
A what?
Like a barber.
A
like
barber?
You, cut hair. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good. What if you're highly educated? What sort of education might be super helpful for inmates?
Law.
Yeah. If you're a white collar criminal and you've got a law degree, those inmates are going to be lining up for your help with their parole hearings and their court dates and all sorts of things. So if you've got one of those shady skills, you're set. All right, so the last two. So passive aggressive protection, that means you have acquired some sort of weapon and you let everyone know that you have it so that they leave you alone. But if all the inmates know that you have a weapon, the correctional officers probably do too. They're going to shake your cell down. They're going to find it. And if you get caught with a weapon, you're going to the hole or solitary confinement, and they might even pop another charge on you for that. The last one is a preemptive strike. So this is what most people that have no experience think, right? So most people, I'm assuming none of you have ever been to prison before, but most have heard that sort of rumor that your first day of prison, you like pick a fight with the biggest guy to let everybody know you're a badass. So that might be a good strategy, but you don't want to come into a prison where you don't know the people or the dynamics, because you might pick the wrong person to try to beat up. Also, if you start a fight, the correctional officers are going to know about it. You're going to the hole, you might get another charge. So the other inmates might leave you alone, or they might not, because what if you accidentally pick the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood to beat up? Like, then you got a big problem. So the most common is withdrawal and avoidance, or aggressive or proactive techniques. So these bottom ones down here, passive aggressive or preemptive strike, withdrawal and avoidance, those are the most common strategies. All right. Questions so far? Okay. I think the theme of this lecture is never go to prison. It's a terrible place. All right, let's talk about prisonization. So prisonization was coined in 1940 by a researcher named Donald Clemmer. And it is the taking on, in a greater or lesser degree, the folkways, mores, customs, and general culture of the penitentiary. So basically what we're describing here is the way that you acclimate to this super violent environment. So one of the main reasons that prisonization occurs is because of the extremely high rate of violence within the prison culture that we just discussed. So this study by Donald Clemmer is a classic prison study. And since then, other researchers have corroborated his ideas and taken it even further. And then the next slide we're going to go over is a more recent study that tests this quantitatively. So research has indicated that people who enter prison with legitimate or non-criminal identities form more deviant identities over time. And those inmates that have stronger deviant identities are the ones that manifest poorer post-release adjustment. So the stronger you are tied to this prison culture, the harder it is to shed that when you get released, which means you're not going to do well in the general environment outside of a prison, because this is not how we act. The other thing to keep in mind, so part of the reason why we want to learn about this prison culture before we start talking about our prison-based rehabilitation programs is because other empirical studies have shown that prisonization adversely affects participation in these prison-based rehabilitation programs. So the stronger you are tied to this prison culture, the less likely you are to want to volunteer to join a prison-based rehabilitation program. When we start talking about the effectiveness of these programs, you need to keep this in mind, that we are doing our best, but we are basically fighting a losing battle, right? We're trying to rehabilitate you in the least rehabilitative environment possible. So keeping in mind any reduction in recidivism from a prison-based rehabilitation program is a really good thing, because of the environment we're dealing with. That would be like trying to do alcohol abuse therapy like in a bar. That's basically what we're attempting to do here. So there are two dominant theories on why prison has this effect on people, this prisonization effect. So the two models we're going to talk about are the importation model and the deprivation model. So the importation model is, I think, the simpler of the two to understand. So to import something means to bring something in. So what this model is saying is that we are taking the worst of the worst from the general population and we are putting them together in a prison environment, right? So of course, if we're taking violent people from the outside and putting them together on the inside, it's going to be a violent institution, right? But whenever you're describing prisonization, you have to be able to explain two things with these theories. One, why is prison more violent than the rest of society? But two, why does prison make you worse over time? So thinking of the importation model, we're taking these violent people and we're putting them all together in an environment. Who can think of a criminology theory that would explain why this makes them more violent over time?
Would it be labeling theory?
Labeling theory, yes, but labeling theory fits a little bit better with the deprivation model.
Okay.
Think of another one that has to do with your peers.
Social learning theory.
There we go. Exactly, right? So even if you were at a moderate level of violence, being around other more violent people is going to make you more violent as well. So the importation model is saying we're basically importing violent people into an institution. And then because of social learning theory and also, Joseph, labeling theory as well, but you'll see in a minute that fits a little bit better with the deprivation model. But being around all of those people learning amongst each other has a lot to do with why these people become more violent over time. So did you guys learn about differential association theory in criminology as well? Does that sound familiar? Did we not learn about that? Differential association is very similar to social learning theory. The only difference is micro versus macro. So social learning theory talks about micro relationships. So it's at the individual level. So why one person hanging out with 3 other people becomes more violent or less violent, whereas differential association is macro. So we're looking at whole environments together. So you could use social learning theory to explain how individuals learn from other individuals, or differential association to explain why certain communities react similarly to similar communities. So the importation model can explain that second part, that deviance, prison increases deviant identities, either through social learning at the micro level or differential association at the macro level. All right, so that's the importation model. Questions on that before we talk about deprivation? All right, the deprivation model, this is based a lot on a book called Asylums, written by Irving Goffman. So Irving Goffman discusses the environment in what he calls a total institution. So for him, a total institution within this book was any sort of prison, incarcerated setting, or the old mental asylums that they had before they were shut down in the 1970s. So what he's saying here is that a total institution has a similar effect on all individuals. And I always feel bad giving this lecture to a bunch of Citadel cadets because it's kind of explaining your experience. But when you're on the outside, it's really easy to look at someone and tell their social status, right? You can see if they have a flashy car or a flashy watch or a brand new wife with brand new boobs, right? You can tell that this person is of high status, right? But in a total institution, they strip you all down of everything that you had, put you in a similar uniform, and you just become a number, like a Seawood. But what we're saying here is that everybody is stripped of everything, right? We're on the same level playing field, but humans will naturally form a hierarchy. That's just what humans do. And usually the hierarchy is formed around what is valued in that institution. So if we're talking about a prison, if we strip you all down and you're all the same, the most violent rise to the top and the weak go to the bottom, right? So another way to understand this is that if you treat someone like an animal, they're gonna act like an animal. So just like Joseph was saying before, labeling theory fits this really well. So who's familiar with the Stanford prison experiment? Ashley, will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so basically it was research done through a college where they created a jail or a prison, and students were randomly assigned to either be guards or prisoners, and they weren't given really any sort of direction. They just let the relationships naturally develop, and the guards ended up really not acting appropriately and treating the prisoners really terribly, just through natural power, like through the power that they assumed. They naturally just started abusing it.
What happened to the prisoners?
I can't remember if some of them like went kind of crazy.
Yes. they did. They had to shut the experiment down super duper early because the guards were like becoming maniacs and the prisoners were becoming super depressed and suicidal. So you play the role that you were given. So if we take a bunch of people and put them in an institution and treat them like an animal, it's not that surprising that they're going to act like an animal. So in 1993, a researcher named Hunt and several colleagues set out with a qualitative study. So basically they're interviewing a bunch of experienced inmates that had been incarcerated for over 20 years. And they wanted to know what caused prisonization. Was it the importation model or the deprivation model? And what they found was that it was a little bit of both, that it's not one or the other. It's the two kind of came together. It's that we're importing these violent people and they learn from each other, but we're also creating this environment that allows for violence. So even if they weren't violent people, they're going to react in this violent way because of how we're treating them. So the importation and the deprivation model are all sort of coalesced to create this nasty environment that we have in prison. All right, questions on that? Okay, so now what we're going to do is talk about a more recent study that tested this. So in 2003, Walters was testing the effect of the first 6 months of incarceration on criminal thinking and identity, and he had two groups. So he had basically a treatment group of novice inmates that had never been incarcerated before and a control group of experienced criminals. And what he did was he gave them all one survey at the same time, which was right at the beginning of the novice inmates' experience in prison. And the experienced inmates just took the same survey at the same time. And then 6 months later, he gave the same survey to them again. And what he found is that over time, over those 6 months, the new novice inmates, we saw an increase in their criminal thinking and identity, whereas the experienced inmates stayed the same, right? So we saw these novice inmates increase their criminal thinking and identity to basically match the experienced inmates. So the survey showed that incarceration meaningfully shapes the thinking and identity of persons unfamiliar with the correctional environments. So the novice inmates had significant increases in self-assertion and deception scales after those first 6 months of incarceration. And if you have a high score in self-assertion or a deception scale, it sort of embodies what we call an attitude of entitlement and a desire for power and control over their social environment. So what we're seeing here is that life in prison encourages individuals unfamiliar with prison culture to adopt these attitudes in an effort to physically and psychologically survive the hardships of incarceration. So the conclusion of this study was that prisonization may be an adaptive response that becomes maladaptive once they've been released. So who can interpret that statement? What does that statement mean in plain English?
Is that like prisonization? It's sort of like saying that like people who go into prison, they need to adapt and become like violent and physical, but that adaptation you're not able to like retract it back once they're released from prison.
Exactly. So keeping this in mind, our recidivism rate of 60% doesn't seem that abnormal. All right. Okay. So that Hunt study that we were just talking about, what's usually pretty common, whenever you're doing a qualitative research, which is interviews, you always go in with an idea of what you want to study. But a lot of times, especially with inmates, you never really know what these guys are going to say. And it's not uncommon for you to come out with your research and say, I have like 2 or 3 other studies that I could publish out of this beyond what I was initially doing. And that's exactly what happened with Hunt and colleagues here. So he conducted a series of interviews with former inmates with the goals of understanding the causes of prisonization, but something much more interesting came out of this as well. What these experienced inmates could not stop talking about was the huge amount of turmoil within the prison. And even more apparent was that there was more turmoil as opposed to the prison life of the past that they were used to. So they went through some of the the reasons for this increased turmoil. We're going to go a little bit more into this in a minute. They were saying newly formed gangs, changes in prison population demographics, like different types of people were coming into prison, as well as new developments in prison policy, especially in relation to gangs. So all of these elements kind of coalesce to create an increasingly unpredictable world that these experienced inmates that have basically spent their life in prison are like now at a loss as to understand how to navigate this new world. So researchers agree that the change in inmate characteristics was one of the unintended causes of prison overcrowding. So predictably, as incarceration rates rose, overcrowding became a huge problem as well. So in 1970, before the incarceration rates rose, prisons were already at 98% capacity. And by 1990, they were at 180% capacity. In order to cope with this, institutions were cramming more than 2 people in a cell. They were putting people in gymnasiums. And when they were increasing the number of people that were being incarcerated, they were not increasing the number of correctional officers that were in the facilities. It got so bad that the Supreme Court had to step in several times and tell these the prisoners brought class action lawsuits, and they said, this is becoming increasingly unsafe. You're jamming, we're at 180% capacity. You haven't increased the number of correctional officers. It's just an unsafe environment. And the Supreme Court had to tell several prisons, it began in Texas, that they had like 100 or so days to release like a third of their prison population. So we started seeing this in the 80s and the 90s, that the courts were demanding that the prisons release people. So of course they start with the nonviolent inmates, but they hit bottom pretty quickly. Then they have to say, okay, well, your violence wasn't that bad, so we'll let you out early. So we started seeing a lot of these people getting released, but the problem is that we weren't changing our policy, our correctional policy. So even though they're slowly releasing because the Supreme Court's forcing them, more and more people were coming in. So this is why we've had such a problem with criminal justice reform, is because of reasons like this. So when Hunt was asking about overcrowding, the inmates were concentrated more on the changes of the characteristics of the inmates that were coming in as a result of these sentencing changes. Specifically, they focused on the growth of new gangs, the immaturity of the new inmates, and the problems that they were causing within the prison. So, starting with the new gangs, as these number of people started coming in and prison became more violent, the inmates started to band together to protect themselves by creating prison gangs. It's a lot easier to run their schemes and plots and extortions too if you've got a whole gang of people behind you to help you. So gangs started becoming very prevalent in the 80s and 90s in prison. And the prison policies were attempting to stem the flow of all of these new gangs, but unfortunately they accidentally made it way worse. So for instance, say we've got the Crips running the Block A, right? So what the administrators would do would be to take the leaders and put them in Block B and leave the foot soldiers in Block A. But now they've just spread the Crips to 2 blocks, right? Or maybe what they'll do is they'll take the leaders from Block A and put them in Block B, and the foot soldiers will put in Block C. But now they've unintentionally created a vacuum in Block A, and now the Bloods will pop up, right? So they actually accidentally made the gang problem a lot worse, just trying to deal with the fact that there were so many prison gangs popping up. So that made prison much more unpredictable and violent. And, you know, these inmates had been incarcerated, the ones they were interviewing had been incarcerated since the 60s when there weren't that many prison gangs. So this was a new environment to them. But the other problem that they really had was what they referred to as the immaturity of the new inmates. So if we think of this in context of those prison sentencing changes, if we are arresting especially more drug offenders, right? And a lot of times if you look at a drug offender's record, they don't have a prior record. So we're arresting all these people that don't have a prior record. We're sending them to prison and for longer periods of time. So these are people that are unfamiliar with the correctional environment and how to survive the correctional environment. So these older inmates, they call themselves convicts. If you ever hear an inmate refer to themselves as a convict, they mean that they are from the old school and they are not one of these new young inmates. So what they're saying here is that these new inmates have no idea or have, they said that they have no juvenile record, and they were saying that as a negative thing. And it is in this instance, right? Because somebody with a juvenile record would never go into a prison and just start shit, right? Because you don't really know who you're going to get in a fight with. And these older guys, these convicts that have been incarcerated for most of their life, have mainly been left alone. They've got enough clout to be left alone. They've done their time. They are solid inmates, solid convicts. And these new guys were coming in and getting up in their face and starting fights with them, asking them where they're from. And they were just like, you know, what is this? I've been here for 30 years. Like, don't mess with me. So they also said, so they're more disrespectful in that respect. They're more violent and unpredictable, because just like we talked about on that violent slide, most people that have never been incarcerated, like the common rumor is that you start a fight on the first day, right? And that's exactly what was happening here, is this influx of these new guys that don't know any better starting fights. And if you're going to pick a fight with somebody, it's probably best to do it with an old guy. And they're picking on these convicts that have a lot of clout in the institution. So they said that they had no sense of what it is to do time. And they said that they were also more egocentric and they were thinking about themselves and not the whole population. So whereas snitching used to be a really big deal and you could never get an inmate to snitch, these new guys will snitch more quickly because they are looking out for themselves and they don't understand that the inmates are supposed to sort of band together. And that's what these old convicts were saying, was that back in the old days, if the inmates wanted something, whether it be, you know, more variety at the commissary or being able to spend another hour out on the yard or whatever it is, all the inmates would band together for a common goal. And they're saying with these new inmates, we're not seeing that. They are unpredictable. They don't know what it's like to do time, and they're sort of messing everything up. So basically what we're seeing here is that all of this was coalescing to create more turmoil within the prisons. So what we're going to do starting on Wednesday, keeping all of this in mind, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about the reading. So in the reading, I want you to be thinking about how these new inmates have affected the prison subculture. And the reading is all about how you do time in prison. It's basically like a step-by-step guide that if you're going to get incarcerated, this is how you behave so you don't get your ass kicked. It is a scholarly article, but it's qualitative, which means it's interviews, which means there's no statistics whatsoever. And their results section is split into like four different themes about how you do time. All right. So everybody make sure they do that reading. It's the Bronson reading. There's a PDF link in this week's module. Questions? No questions? All right. Well, we will continue talking about this happy topic of prison life. On Wednesday, we'll discuss that Bronson reading a little bit. I definitely meant to mention all this stuff that we're talking about is mainly, so this subculture has more to do with the male inmate experience. We are going to talk about the female experience. We're going to talk about that specifically. So everything that we've been talking about up until this point has mainly been about males. The only thing that's been very similar is that we are also seeing a huge skyrocket in the number of females that are being incarcerated. We'll talk a little bit about that on Wednesday as well. But so far, all that stuff we've talked about is mainly talking about males, because females only make up about 14% of the entire correctional population. So we'll talk about their prison experience in a separate slide. All right. Okay, if there are no questions, then I will see you guys on Wednesday, and make sure you do that reading, all right?
Thank you, ma'am.